So, as I mentioned in my tweet before I went live, it seems like the newsfeed is just going to be dominated by uh, the ongoing genocide in Gaza until that either gets resolved or until Israel kills all the Palestinians or forces them all out of their land, which is a pretty likely turn of events at this point, that Israel just goes through with it. So, I do have some news from that front. Here we go. A brief distraction from the game. This is a resignation letter from the UN. The director of the UN's New York office in New York City just resigned after 30 years at the organization over the UN's handling of ongoing genocide of Palestinians. The entirety of his resignation letter is a necessary read, but this first page blew me away. And let's read the first page. I will like and retweet. Dear High Commissioner, this is a letter to the UNHCR. This is part of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights? Okay, yeah, there we go. This will be my last official communication to you as a director of the New York office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I write at a moment of great anguish for the world, including for many of our colleagues. Once again, we are seeing a genocide unfolding before our eyes, and the organization that we serve appears powerless to stop it. As someone who has investigated human rights in Palestine since the 1980s, lived in Gaza as a UN human rights advisor in the 1990s, and carried out several human rights missions to the country before and since, this is deeply personal to me. I also worked in these halls through the genocide against the Tutsis, Bosnian Muslims, the Yazidi, and the Rohingya. In each case, when the dust settled on the horrors that had been perpetrated against defenseless civilian populations, it became painfully clear that we had failed in our duty to meet the imperatives of prevention of mass atrocities, of protection of the vulnerable, and of accountability for perpetrators. And so, it has been with successive waves of murder and persecution against the Palestinians throughout the entire life of the UN. High Commissioner, we are failing again. As a human rights lawyer with more than 3 decades of experience in the field, I know well that the concept of genocide has often been subject to political abuse. But the current wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in an ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology, in continuation of decades of their systematic persecution and purging, based entirely upon their status as Arabs, and coupled with explicit statements of intent by leaders in the Israeli government and military, leaves no room for doubt or debate. In Gaza, civilian homes, schools, churches, mosques, and medical institutions are wantonly attacked as thousands of civilians are massacred. In the West Bank, including occupied Jerusalem, homes are seized and reassigned based entirely on race, and violent settler pogroms are accompanied by Israeli military units. Across the land, apartheid rules. This is a textbook case of genocide. The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase, towards the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. What's more, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and much of Europe are wholly complicit in the horrific assault. Not only are these governments refusing to meet their treaty obligations, quote, to ensure respect, unquote, for the Geneva Conventions, but they are in fact actively arming the assault, providing economic and intelligence support, and giving diplomatic and political cover for Israel's atrocity. Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights, Wilson, Geneva. That's the address that this was sent to. On the letter itself, I have no notes. This is about as well as you could put this. And it seems to be all the more prescient considering this clip would surface just a day or two later. Like hang on, let me see the date on this tweet. October 31st? This is November 1st. This is literally the next day this CNN interview happens. This is a spokesperson for Israel in some capacity. Something diplomacy directorate. So she's an Israeli diplomat.
But I can tell you that we are not targeting anyone else in Gaza but civilians.
There it is.
Hamas is cynically, but rather terrorists, of course.
You can see his reaction there. He's like, I know what you meant. It's like, don't worry. We all heard it.
But I can tell you that we are not targeting anyone else in Gaza but civilians. Hamas is cynically, but rather terrorists, of course. But
this is quite possibly the largest Freudian slip of all time. The single biggest Freudian slip I have ever seen. And here's the thing, right? Listen to it again.
But I can tell you that we are not targeting anyone else in Gaza but civilians.
That wasn't a mistake. That was like she knew what she wanted to say in her head. There's one level of Freudian slip that I've done before where you just sort of jumble words and like you immediately catch yourself and you realize, oh, bleh, that was wrong. I didn't mean to say that. I didn't want to say that. But this flows too well, I think, to be that. Like, and regardless of what I think about what's inside this woman's head, I think everybody who sees this video, everybody who has seen this video, including, by the way, this guy, the CNN interviewer, which you can see his, here, hold on, if I take a look at this again, god dang it. You can see his like raised eyebrow reaction. His eyebrow becomes even more raised.
But I can tell you that civilians, Hamas is cynically, but rather terrorists, of course.
You can see there his eyebrow raises just a little bit more at the end. Sorry for the leftist audio as it's all garbled, me forwarding through it and stuff. What a Freudian slip is that? The one thing I wanted to say about this, it's one thing for me to just show that, right? The other thing I wanted to do was add a little bit of context for the UNHCR resignation letter that this guy submitted to the High Commissioner, right? So the UNHCR is the human rights wing of the United Nations, effectively. They deal with, like, diasporas, refugees and things like that. The problem is, right, it is composed, even though it is composed mostly, if not entirely, I give a lot of credit to the UN for, in large part, being composed of people who want to do good. The structure of the UNHCR is designed to systematically, is designed in such a way that it mimics and sort of resembles the imperial powers that helped to construct it in the first place. This genocide, as the New York Commissioner laid out, this genocide is one example where the UNHCR is failing at its stated mission. But as history has shown, in fact, throughout the various genocides that the UNHCR has failed to prevent, it's clear that no other outcome was going to happen from the UNHCR in its current state, right? It failed to intervene in Rwanda because the Western world at the time was trying to wash its hands of all of the colonialism that was that had been going on in the region for decades, for centuries, at their hand, and that meant just letting the genocide happen. Them sort of not interfering, although simultaneously they were engaging in neo-colonialism. It's just sort of, it's like the optics of it is such that politicians don't want to set foot in it, and that partially dictates the UN's decisions, because the UN isn't an apolitical entity. Then I don't know what they were referring to with the Yazidi. I don't remember learning about that one. But with the Bosnian Muslims, that's one case in which I think NATO intervened in that instance. Once intel had come out that Serbia was in fact planning a mass ethnic cleansing, But again, this was an instance where the UN was largely toothless and unable to do anything. And of course, we've also seen in cases where the UN does do something, like the blue, sending in the blue helmets, in cases like Haiti, often it is to the detriment of the country that is in need of the help in the first place. So it just seems like the UN is at best, it's the kind of guy that is so incompetent that they'd mess up a free lunch. And at worst, it's a accidental recreation of the sort of colonial structures, at least in a much softer way. But the other thing I wanted to mention was how the UNHCR handles refugees. So this is also going to rely on my knowledge of certain cases that I learned about in college, that I read about in textbooks and things like that. But the UNHCR has to process people that are fleeing from certain countries, claiming political asylum, and things like that, or fleeing from conflict in their home countries. The refugees that go through the UNHCR are treated the same way as migrants. They're treated that way certainly by the border guards and the immigration police that they end up in the custody of in nations where they end up going to, but also in their dealings with the UNHCR. There is there's all sorts of application processes and stuff. There's a demand for some sort of statehood of each person. You know how I was talking about the other time that Gazans are stateless. They have no documentation, or virtually no documentation, that a state would be able to recognize and to say, oh, here, look, this is a person, an identifiable person with certain social markers written down on paper so that they could receive government services. A lot of people who need asylum, the people who need it the most, in fact, do not have that documentation. And those people, as a product of the UNHCR, having that system where you need to fill out an application and you have to produce some sort of documentation to be able to get your case through so they can actually process you and get you out of the country where you'd be in trouble. As a product of that, it systematically rejects the people that would need that kind of help the most. The very poorest and most vulnerable, because they either had no documentation and they had no papers to begin with, or maybe the state got to them somehow, in some limited capacity, and was able to destroy their papers so they would be unable to leave. But yes, that is a lot of words to say that I completely agree with the New York, the now former New York commissioner here, that the UN has failed many times, and it is failing again. This stuff about the UNHCR being, processing people like migrants, that can be borne out through the the Iran-Iraq War. A lot of people fled from Iran during that war for fear of being conscripted, and tried to escape to various places. And there's this whole, how a lot of conservatives and some liberals will fearmonger about coyotes and the traffickers at the southern border. Imagine that, but 10 times worse, and that's what people have to deal with when they are fleeing from difficult political situations in the Middle East and trying to, through some passageway, get to Europe. A lot of the reason on paper that European countries allow boats full of migrants to drown at sea is because those boats are not official. They're the passage of migrants on those boats is not written down in some official manifest somewhere where you could see, oh yeah, a ferry departed at this time. It's all off the books, sort of shady and human traffic-y, but all these people are trying to escape from a very difficult situation at home. And because they are, well, first of all, because they're brown, but then second of all, because there is no real resemblance of state legitimacy to the methods by which people are escaping, they just let them drown at sea, or they let them languish in certain in squalor lodgings in countries just short of the line where the European Union border is. A lot of people get stuck in Turkey, in like rundown housing or tenements or wherever, trying to get through to Greece and wherever so that they can actually reach somebody who can give them some papers. So that whenever they are asked for papers, even if it's a paper with nothing on it, they can at least produce it. But a lot of people don't even have that, and that is why the UN fails. That is why the UNHCR time and again has proven useless at addressing the problem of why do these genocides keep happening and how can we stop them? Because ultimately, they are created from the same template that the states who commit these genocides are produced from. So they would always accidentally find themselves ineffective at stopping those states. I hope that made sense. I know I could, you know, it's very easy for me to have gotten lost in the weeds there, but I really want people to understand that, like, the UN has always and will always fail when it's presented with a situation like this. I don't think there's a single success story of the UN being able to prevent a genocide. And as long as this framework persists of absolutely needing papers, regardless of the circumstances that people are stuck in, and basically having to, like, scrutinizing people to the greatest possible degree, as long as that persists, as long as this weird, like, bureaucratic framework of we can only process you if you have your papers and you have some way to be processed in the conventional way, as long as that persists and as long as the UN upholds certain norms of nation-state borders, then there never will be a success story of the UNHCR or the United Nations being able to prevent a genocide or a mass death event.